Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Cucina, Aurora Kitchen Witchery podcast, another episode of Conversational Witchcraft. And I'm really excited about today's episode because today I have joining me J. Allen Cross. J. Allen Cross is a practicing witch of Mexican, Native American, and European descent whose craft was shaped by his Catholic upbringing and mixed family culture. Living in his home state of Oregon, he works as a psychic medium and occult specialist for a well-known paranormal investigation team out of the Portland metro area. When he's not investigating, he enjoys providing spells and potions to his local community, exploring haunted and abandoned places, working as a consultant for other workers and investigators, and of course, writing about witchcraft. Jay, I'm so excited you're here.
I am so excited to be here as well. We've had a few misconnections, but we made it.
I know.
We're here.
I think we've been trying to book this for I feel like the first one was 2 months ago and you canceled, then I canceled, and we just couldn't make it work. And here we are. Thank goodness.
Here we are. We made it work. We made it happen. That's all that matters.
And you are in one of my favoriteest places in the whole wide world. You're in Oregon.
Yes, absolutely.
I have had quite a few of my Pacific Northwest witches come on this show, and it is literally one of my favorite places in the world. I feel like if I'm originally from New York, but if I didn't settle here in New England, I would totally be there because the 90s is alive and well in Portland, Oregon. And
it really is.
Yeah. And the 90s is alive and well in me. And so that's my partner and I took a vacation to Portland a couple of years ago before the pandemic. And it was like my dream vacation because it's like all the food, like it's all everything is food and coffee.
Yes.
Right.
A lot of food, a lot of coffee, a lot of beer.
And I can't have beer because I'm gluten-free, but it was like beer for him, coffee for me, all the food in the world. And then of course we drove to Astoria to see the Goonies beach and the Goonies house and all of that stuff because I'm a giant nerd. So
absolutely.
Right. It's the best thing. It was the best trip ever. And I'm just gonna gush on that for a minute. Sorry, go ahead.
When the tour, when Cher and Cyndi Lauper were touring, apparently they came through Portland, and near the end of Cindy's set, suddenly the crowd starts going, Goonies, Goonies, because she did the song for it. And she was like, oh my God, we're in Oregon. We have to do it.
They have to do it.
And so like her band just figured it out and they did it specifically for Portland. So
that is amazing.
God bless the Goonies.
God bless the Goonies. Right. Say it again. God bless the Goonies. Hey, you guys. I'm sorry. I've got to stop because we went out to, what is it? Haystack Rock. And it was literally, I shouldn't say it's like one of the top 10 best days of my life. I couldn't stop laughing. My partner and I, we literally drove there listening to the Goonies soundtrack. I told you we had like John Williams soundtrack like playing in the back. I'm telling you, this is the level of nerd that I am. I don't know if anybody else out there is a giant nerd.
That is wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Don't judge me. Don't judge me. Judge me all you want. It's my show. You can judge me as much as you like. I am so excited to have you because I have never had on this show a Mexican-American folk magician before. And I'm looking right at your book. I know, so the time of recording this, it's actually the summertime, but I know by the time this airs, it'll be September, and your new book, which is about haunting, will come out. And we're going to talk about that later. But the current book that I'm looking at is American Brujería. Did I say it correctly? Brujería. Brujería. I said it correctly. I made sure that I got my pronunciation right. And so, yeah, I've never had anyone on this show come talk about Mexican-American folk magic. And so I'm really, really, really intrigued because as a practicing witch who is of European descent, also raised Catholic. So we're gonna bond over that. I have very little knowledge of what you practice. And so I'm really interested to know, like, start at the beginning, Jay. Like, are these traditions, or some of these traditions, like things you grew up with, or is this a path you found on your own as you developed into your path?
It was a little bit of both, honestly, because I grew up, we knew we were Mexican, and we grew up Catholic, as you do. That was something I was just raised with, but my mom was adopted, and so we didn't actually find her birth family and really connect with our culture until a little bit later. I was probably about 10 or 11 when we found, no, maybe a little younger than that, when we found her birth family and kind of reconnected with them and really kind of connected all of our ancestry dots and figured out what was going on there. And so growing up, my mom was very much into reclaiming some of our culture, some of our heritage, things like that, which was very important. It was also very important to me. I really, really wanted to learn Spanish, which I did not grow up with. So I took all the Spanish classes available to me throughout middle school and high school. I won an award for Spanish in high school. Yeah. So a lot of it was attempts at reclaiming it. But then again, anyone will tell you that there's something sneaky about Ancestry and about DNA where things just kind of show up. And even though there were things later that I found out that were kind of like Mexican culture specific that we were already very much doing or already very much kind of in tune to. So it's something that's kind of inherently there in you. But as far as finding the vocabulary, finding the terminology for it, finding, the language and all of that, that was something that I built over an entire lifetime. So a lot of this was stuff that I was familiar with or had been around, especially a lot of like the Catholic things and the saint things, learning the language, all of that. But then to actually write the book, I wanted to be very clear that it wasn't just me speaking through this book, because my community is so much bigger than just me, And so in order to do the book, I started to contact every Mexican American person that I knew and started sitting down with them and interviewing them, about their families, about their traditions, about, like this magic stuff that kind of creeps up into it. And what was so funny is I'd sit down with them and I'd be like, okay, so I'm writing a book on Mexican American folk magic. And they'd be like, no, I don't do that. You got the wrong person. And I'm like, hold up. Let me ask you a question. Normally I'd ask them about like something like Vicks Vapor Rub or something like that. And that would lead into them suddenly having this big realization that they were actually surrounded by magic their entire lives and they didn't even realize it. And once they figured it out, this flood of stuff would come out of them. And then they'd tell me everything that they could remember. And then when they couldn't remember, they'd call their moms or their grandmas, or they'd bring them in to sit down and speak with me. Too, because they're like, tell them about the thing, or the time that you saw El Cucuy, or my cousin saw La Llorona. And then they said and then all these stories just came out. And so I have all these notebooks just full of stories and recipes and things their grandmas used to do or their grandparents used to do, or all these other things. And I was like, this is where it's at. And so
can you give an example? Can you give an example of one of those things that was like kind of seemingly innocuous as a child, either for you or someone that you interviewed? Seemingly innocuous. This is a thing that we grew up with, right? I'll give an example. An Italian American kid growing up in New York, you always stirred your gravy, which is what we call in New York. If it has meatballs in it's gravy. If it doesn't, it's sauce, right? That's a big, no, don't send me letters. Don't comment that it's sauce and not gravy. Okay. That's a thing. So, but you always stirred clockwise and you always had to have your wooden spoon, right? Like my grandmother was like, this is the most important thing. This is, like you said, this is where it's at. And then as as I developed into a practicing witch, I was like, oh, she's using that as her wand. And oh, this is kitchen witchery and blah, blah, blah. So can you give me an example for yourself or for someone else of something like that? You mentioned Vicks Vapor Rub, and I don't know what you're talking about. So tell me what you're talking about, because that's intriguing.
Exactly. Because that was the one that really ended up being the gateway for a lot of people. It's either I would either ask about Vicks Vapor Rub or if they had ever seen a ghost. And usually that would crack it wide open for them. So something that really happened, I love this story and I tell it often because it's my favorite. I was sitting with this person and I'm like, okay, so, I'm writing this book on Mexican American folk magic. And they're like, oh, I can't help you. And I'm like, let's just see. And I asked them like, okay, so did your family use Vicks Vapor Rub? And they're like, well, of course, we're Mexican, of course we use Vicks Vapor Rub. And I'm like, well, can you just tell me about that? She's like, well, yeah, so my mom, she used to do this thing where like I'd get sick. And so she'd get out the Vicks and she'd mix it with salt and some of her own saliva. And then she'd mix it up and then she'd apply it to me in the shape of the cross. And while she would say this thing, this, sana, sana, coli, and then she'd go, and I was like, uh-huh. And she's like, that's magic. And I'm like, it is magic. And she's like, but then what about this over here? And then that over there. And I'm like, yes. And so often the Vicks is what would start it, because Vicks is a very magical thing. And a lot of the times people don't realize that, because Vicks gets its very, very noticeable scent from some very important plants, which are eucalyptus and camphor, which are very powerful, cleansing, protective, healing plants.
Yes.
And if you look at really old advertisements for Vicks, like back in the day, because Vicks has been around for a really long time, the advertisements look like how we would maybe advertise something like Florida water, where it's like a little bit more spiritual than just kind of like unblock your sinuses, like, or calm your cough, and so it's kind of an old holdover, because it used to kind of be marketed as more magical, and we've kind of lost that these days, but people still remember, or they still know what's in it. And Vicks Vapor Rub, it has this energy that's not only clearing but very opening, very energizing, very uplifting. And so you can utilize it in all kinds of things. And so in my book, I have a whole section on spells utilizing Vicks Vapor Rub.
But you're saying that is really using it with intention. What I'm hearing is the using it with intention, right? Because we've all had an experience where we've used something like Vicks or something like that, in the way that it's meant to be used, right? But you're saying that using it with the intention and really reciting an incantation or drawing symbols on the body in that magical practice, whether or not you realize at the time it was a magical practice, that this is something that's very prevalent in Mexican American families.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I've never heard of that. I don't know a single Italian person that has ever done that. Do you know what I mean? So like that's very, very interesting to me, that is a thing that you're saying, that there's this whole group of people that use this in this magical way and don't realize it. How cool is that? How eye-opening was that for you to discover, like, there's this thread of magic running through this culture, right?
Yes.
How that must have been a really exciting journey for you.
It was so wonderful to see it. And it was so funny because, this is folk magic,
right,
which means that every household is going to approach it a little bit differently. Everyone has kind of like their own spin on it about how this is supposed to go. And they'll disagree with one another about it. I always kind of liken it to kind of like, your grandma's and like that pie recipe or something. Oh, no. She adds cinnamon, but, I add nutmeg because it's better. And they'll kind of fight about it,
right,
about which one's better. And at the end of the day, it's pie and it's delicious, no matter which way you do it.
Truth. I mean, who doesn't want pie? Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So I got to see all these different variations.
Wow.
And people's rules. Sometimes they knew why they had the rules. Sometimes they didn't know why they had the rules. Sometimes they'd have to call their mom or something like that and try and figure out why you'd only do the egg cleansing on like a Tuesday, Thursday, things like that.
Yeah.
So that was very neat to see that kind of through line of, okay, they all use the egg in this fashion, but there's a lot of the details are always a little bit different.
Yeah. And that's something that's so interesting, right? Because like you said, it's folk magic. So depending on someone's upbringing or even the region, right? Like like you from this area, you from that area, how far back does your family history go to a certain area? That can really influence, like you said, the cinnamon versus nutmeg, right? Right. Like going back to my example before, like gravy versus sauce, like that's really like, you could be in Queens and one block is like, one Italian block is like, no, it's gravy. And the other Italian block it's Queens. It's sauce, because this section is from, Sicily and this section is from, Tuscany, and they're like fighting it out. Right. It's true. It's really, really interesting. So let's get into a little bit of this. You were raised Catholic. And so what, I don't even know, like there's so many questions. You talk in the book about the Mexican saints, right?
Yes.
So again, as someone who was raised Catholic, familiar with the saints, Roman Catholic saints in the church and all of that jazz. But how can you explain to everyone how Mexican saints versus your Roman Catholic saints might be the same and might be different, and how to work with them in the same or different ways?
Absolutely. So I love being both a witch and being Catholic, because it really throws people for a loop very intensely, because as soon as I say that I'm Catholic, they think that I'm like just loving the institution of the church and the Pope and everything that comes with that. It's like, oh no. This is not the Catholicism that you're familiar with.
Right.
This is a different kind of Catholicism,
Right.
one that is actually quite subversive when it comes to the church, because the church has not necessarily been a very a happy, healthy force in
I would say that's
in
correct.
the world in general, but especially in Mexico, for sure. And so while a lot of people are very much believers in the Catholic religion, the rules tend to kind of be a little iffier when it comes to Mexican culture. And we tend to do things that the church doesn't really like. So a good example would be the folk saints that we have. So when you have a saint, you have somebody who was very notable in their life, that did something very beneficial. And then after their death, and during their life too, they might have shown some sort of supernatural ability or gift, which is funny because a lot of the things that they used to test people for like to be witches, like the magical things that would happen, were also the things that made people saints, but that's a whole different story. And then after they died, they would continue to help people. That's kind of a very normal saint story kind of equation, that you get a saint when those things are met. Well, one of the very important things to become a Catholic saint is that you are, number one, super Catholic and lived a very, very Catholic life. Well, when you come to Mexican folk saints, we meet most of that criteria minus the last one. So for instance, one of the very famous Mexican folk saints is Jesus Malverde, who was kind of like this sort of Robin Hood character, who he was a robber, he was a burglar. And he would steal from these wealthy people and then give to those who had less. And he was a very important character. Some say that his story is kind of like an amalgamation of a few people, but the story kind of goes that he had pulled off such increasingly amazing heists and stolen so much from these like very oppressive, political leaders, that one day, the story varies, but one day the governor says like, okay, I'm going to test you. If you can steal this thing, and again, the story changes. Sometimes it's the governor's daughter, and sometimes it's like a sword on his mantelpiece or something like that.
Okay.
And then they're like, if you can get this, we'll just let you go. We'll just call it fair and square. Of course, it was a trap.
Yes.
But the story goes that some stories say that he did it, but then they found him later. Other times that he was caught during it, and then executed publicly, and his body was left out in the public as a
lesson for everybody. Don't steal. But I'm sure the people were like, you killed our hero, so now he's martyred, right?
Exactly. So yes, martyred, very much so. But then people would pray to him for help, and miracles would begin to happen. And so he became one of them. Very similarly too, there was Juan Soldado, who it translates to like Soldier John, who was a soldier in Tijuana. And around the time he was in Tijuana, this little girl was murdered, and he was framed for it. He was innocent, but he was framed for it. And so all these riots happen. Everyone wants him dead. He murdered this little girl. And so they finally just say, hey, bro, why don't you just run and we'll shoot you, and that'll be it. So he takes off. They end up shooting him, and it comes to light kind of the next day that they had the wrong guy.
Oh,
and so where he was murdered, where he was shot, people began to come and they kept trying to clean up the bloodstains, and they kept returning. And so people came and started dropping rocks there to make like a cairn, to mark the place of his death. And they kept trying to like move the rocks and clean up the bloodstains again, and they'd return and they'd return. And so now, even today, you can go to his gravesite where they actually put his body, where he's actually interred, and people pray for all kinds of miracles. It's said that you can see him walking around there. People ask him for help in immigration, border crossings, help with addiction, all kinds of things.
Wow.
But the thing about these folk saints, though, is that the church will not recognize them.
Right.
And the church is very upset that we would do something like that.
Sure.
But it makes sense, because these were people that were very important in Mexico. These were stories that were very important in Mexico. Absolutely. And clearly they are still continuing to help people.
Yeah.
So we kind of fly in the face of the Catholic Church a little bit.
Well,
when it comes to this stuff, and kind of do our own thing a lot of the time.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, because these folk saints they're the people. They're not somebody in another country in a far off land who might have done this thing once upon a time
with a very idealized story.
Correct. Yeah. That I would, not to make assumptions, but like that to me says I identify with this individual. And if I identify with this individual, then I feel a kinship or a closeness with this spirit. And that becomes easier for me to see myself in it, and then work with that energy. Right. I mean, that's why so many of us do like, this type of goddess magic, or this type of, worship or whatever, because we feel close to that, the embodiment of whatever that energy is. Right. So in this, you've got these amazing folk saints that are the embodiment of these energies, but they are your people. They're not from somewhere else. So there's a really deep connection and heritage there. Right. Which I don't think a lot of cultures have, I shouldn't say that. I should reword that to say those of us that have been disconnected from ancestry and have found things that speak to us that aren't necessarily, as I said before, I'm Italian, but a lot of the witchcraft that I do is, Celtic, right? And or at least that's how I was introduced to a lot of the witchcraft that I do in the beginning. That's what it was out there, and that's what I could find. That's what I was drawn to, because I didn't have anything of that spoke to me. Right. So it's so wonderful to hear that you have these saints and these stories that are of your culture. I mean, and I hope I don't sound like, like an idiot. Like I said, I don't know anything about Mexican American folk magic. So I'm just really, really intrigued by it. And for
You're
those,
absolutely right.
For those people that don't know, I'm sorry, go ahead. You were going to comment on what I said.
Oh no, I was gonna say you're absolutely right, because it's true. It's these people were one of us. They understood us. At the same time, too, the Catholic Church would also like to exert a lot of control over the people by saying, well, the Catholic saints aren't going to help you unless you meet this very specific criteria of person, a lot of which is based off of, socioeconomic privilege. Like, oh, you don't commit crimes, and you don't steal, or you don't do these things, that this very long list of things that the church frowns upon. And so for the people to have a group of saints that did not care, right, if you needed to sell something illegal to feed your family, which is fairly common. People have to do what they need to do to survive. And so to have a group of saints that were not judging them was very important.
And to also be like, well, we don't fucking care what you say. We have our own saints. So, we can do the whole, Father, Son, Holy Spirit stuff. But then we've got this whole like we got our own saints. So maybe there's just the one God, and maybe there's just the one Jesus, but we got you can have your saints and we'll have our saints. We'll have the same Jesus, but you have yours, I have mine, and we're all good, right? Like, I feel like that, I feel like that makes a lot of sense. And it probably gives a people a lot of freedom in the way that they worship, which of course the Catholic Church is not known for, allowing people the freedom to worship in a way that they want to, in a way that they feel most comfortable. So for those of us that don't know as much history, right? The Catholic Church was brought into Mexico through the Spanish. Am I correct? Right. Okay. Yeah. So Spanish invasion. And there is if I go back in my mind and in my history, which I should have, think about very deeply, but there's an eradication of an old way of worshiping, an old, very, very ancient religions and ancient cultures through these invasions. So where do we see any threads of those ancient religions mixed with the Catholic influence to create more folk magic within Mexican American folk magic?
Oh, there's so much. Especially so, like, I mean, you'll see it in a lot of things, but especially in kind of two main places. You'll see that with Our Lady of Guadalupe, who very much through their symbols and her appearance, there's a lot of controversy around her, because like people will get very upset and be like, she's the Virgin Mary, and other people get very upset and be like, no, she is the indigenous goddess Tonantzin, who was goddess of kind of like, she was kind of like the mother goddess, like corn, land, things like that all kind of fell under her jurisdiction. She was this enormous figurehead in Mesoamerican spirituality. And we see a lot of those symbols present in Our Lady of Guadalupe that don't tend to necessarily be as present in the other Marys, as we would say. She's clearly one of the ones that kind of stands out. Yeah. And a lot of everything from kind of like the black sash she wears that shows that she's pregnant, all kinds of things are very specific to that kind of ancient culture. At the same time, too, there were so many stories before the Spanish even got there of a young brown girl, as they would call her, who would show up in this temple that was already built there, and would, hear the prayers and answer their prayers and things like that. And then Guadalupe shows up and is like, hey, that temple that used to be there? Could you build me one right there, please? Right. Thank you. And it's like, oh, okay. So this is clearly not a new spirit here, one that is simply kind of like the rest of the culture having to assimilate or change at least a little bit of how they come across at face value a little bit. A lot of that ancient indigenous culture had to be kind of hidden a little bit. The other place where it comes through a lot is through the practice of curanderismo, which is a very, very old practice in Mexico. It goes all the way back. It's ancient healing practices, essentially. But it's so much more holistic, because it's not just, medical care, which it is. There's a lot of herbal medicine involved in it. There's also different kinds of curanderos. So they have like hueseras were ones that would fix bones, like bone setting.
Oh, wow.
Because in a lot of these places, even after the Spanish showed up, even today, there are places where the nearest doctor is about a 2-hour drive.
Yeah.
If not more, in some of these places. And this information I have a tiny chihuahua barking at me. This information and these practices really lived on through the practice of the curanderos. And then they, of course, adopted Catholicism into it. So we find kind of like this mix again of kind of Catholicism and the indigenous. But a lot of the practices, a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the skills are very old and really didn't necessarily come from Spain as much.
It's so interesting because in so many cultures, the knowledge of the, for lack of a better word, magic, the knowledge of the spiritual elements of things comes through whomever was the healing people, right? So within a tribe or within a community, you would have, you know, the one healer or the one midwife or the one, you know, the one person who could do things like make a tea or deliver babies or whatever. And that person tends to be the one that brings these traditions and these magics through, you know, century after century after century. It can be, it's woven into that in the culture through the healer. Totally off topic, but it makes me fucking crazy that it is always the healers that then become demonized for being witches, that then become the people, right? It's always the healers, and it's usually the women. 80% of the time, right? It's usually the women. But that just, it's so interesting to see that it's everybody, you know, like this has been it's a thread for everybody. I want to know, well, I kind of want to go back to something you said earlier. You said something earlier about ancestry is a sneaky thing. And it sneaks up on you. And I'm really interested. I want to go back to like little Jay, like you being a kid. And you said to me earlier, you know, you were always kind of looking for that connectivity and, you know, that link to heritage, and kind of talk to us about that journey. I've spoken to someone recently about, she's actually an ancestral healer, right? And that's the type of work that she does. Specifically for a 30-year career, that's all she does is ancestral magic. And for myself personally, I don't have a real healthy relationship with ancestry, right? And it hasn't been since I've, you know, in the last maybe 10 years of my life where I've really leaned into a lot of my Italian heritage, because you always thought, well, you know, my family's fucking crazy. So like, I don't really know anything about them. And I don't know where they came from. And then, you know, something happens and you go, wait a second, you know, how do I tie that back to this tether from this old world and this tether to ancestry? And this woman said to me, and this is going to stick, it's one of those things that's going to stick with me forever. She said, you don't know your ancestors, but believe me, honey, they know you. And they love you. And all those that came before are there watching you, and they're following you, and they're with you. So talk to me a little bit about your experience finding that tether, and where are you now in that journey? I know you've written this book, and you work with spirits and you work with ancestors, but I always feel like there's so much further to go, right? So can you tell us like your experience with that, and back from being a kid into this?
It's a very kind of weird, convoluted story of kind of how we ended up coming back to, you know, really understanding who exactly we are as far as ancestry is concerned. So my mother was adopted, and when she was adopted very young, her parents were told that she was Irish and she was Danish, and that there was just a little itty bitty bit of Spanish in there. And
whoops.
Yeah, looking at my mother, clearly she's not Danish. Like, my mother is brown, as am I. And so we're like, okay, but she always kind of knew in her soul. And it was very, I mean, anyone who looked at her could know, but, you know, it was very, she just kind of knew. She's had this innate knowing that this was part of who she was. And so, you know, we find her birth family, all of that. We get all this confirmation that we're very Native American. and have these Mexican roots and all this stuff. And she was told as well that her father actually was of Danish heritage. And so we're like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, cool. So the Mexicans on my grandmother's side, blah, blah, blah. So I start my ancestor work at the altar. And my ancestors are not super responsive. And I'm like, and I had done a lot of work specifically to uncover kind of my grandfather's side of things, kind of this Danish side that I was not very connected to. So I was like, I want to like I went on to ancestry.com, mapped this this tree back to the old country, like all this stuff, found pictures of people from the 1800s, like all this stuff, and still like the ancestors were not real responsive at the altar. And occasionally I'd ask them questions like, are you my ancestors? And they'd be like, no. And I'd be like, oh God, what am I speaking to? Do I have some sort of weird spirit here or whatever?
Right.
No, my grandma just kind of lied about who my grandfather was a little bit. But she was at this point already passed. And so we couldn't really get the details. And we found this out because my mother took a DNA test and it comes back like 100% Native American and Mexican. Because we are Mexicans, but we are also Puebloan, Native American, which is New Mexico territory, which was also part of Mexico, original Mexico, before the border was moved.
Yes.
Is like 100% of where she's from. And so then that was a big part of it. So magically, me finding this was me connecting with the ancestors on my grandmother's side, who were very heavily Puebloan. My family line goes way back to one very specific town in New Mexico, where like they were from for like 1,000 years.
Wow.
And so, and so getting to know them as well, they were very responsive through my ancestor practice. And this was years ago. And they're the ones that ended up reconnecting me with Catholicism and eventually to what I now call American brujería, because I was like, hey, like, I want you guys to be involved in my magic, because the weird magical witchy stuff comes from my mom's side, which comes from my grandma's side. To find out we were like mystical people in the Puebloan area. And so I'm like, hey, like, I do this magic stuff. I want you guys involved in this. And they're like, cool. It has to be something that we recognize though. And I'm like, okay. And up until that point, I had been very much a witch's witch. I was against anything Christian, very much anti my Catholic upbringing, pagan all the way. How dare anyone else suggest that? And they're like, what about a saint? And what about the Bible? What about the rosary?
So
and
these ancestors are giving you like all this message in spirit, and they're like, no, dude, it's great that that's what you're doing, but if you want to work with me, you guys speak my language. And you're like, son of a bitch.
So then I find myself in the very back of a little Mexican grocery store off of Powell in Portland. And it's one of those like, if you want to use the bathroom, you have to get the key that's attached like a big wooden spoon. There's like flypaper hanging from the ceiling and stuff like that.
But they have the
500-year-old lady sitting behind the counter, absolutely. And I'm like, okay, this is like the realest place I've ever been in. And little did I know that there, among the like flickering light that needed changed and the flypaper hanging from the ceiling, that I would find God and magic and all that stuff. Because way in the back where they brought me was this shelf hidden kind of like behind like the Fabuloso and like were all these saints candles. And
they're the folk saints that we were talking about.
No, they were the Catholic ones.
They're the Catholic saints.
They're the Catholic ones, but then they also had like a bunch of other ones too that are not, they're not very Catholic oriented, but they had all these novena candles. And that's kind of where it all started for me. And I was like, okay, like I hear you. So I bought a few of these. I bought like a Guadalupe one, and I bought a Saint Martha because I thought she might be the only saint that would understand me. and I took them home, and that's how it began.
I can imagine you standing there and seeing those candles and just being immersed in that place. Like you're describing it so clearly. I imagine them bringing you back there and seeing that shelf. And I could almost feel this excitement in your, like in your core, right? That's sort of like butterflies in your stomach.
Like my heart beating, and I can
Like,
feel their hands on my back, like pushing me forward. Like
that deep knowledge of this is exactly where I'm supposed to be.
Yes.
Right. And like,
and there's something so powerful here and something so old here in this very weird place that you wouldn't expect to find God in this place. And yet I felt it there stronger than I had in any other church in my
but your ancestors put you there for a reason, because they knew that you would see this and you would have that moment and you would have that tug on your soul, you know, that kind of just light bulb moment, like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. Oh, this is that moment. And I just think that's just the most breathtaking story. On that note, we're going to take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsors, and then we're going to come right back. And I have like 2 other questions I need to ask you before we can like get into your new book, but because I'm so into this conversation. So let's take a quick break and we'll hear from our fancy sponsors, and we'll be right back. We are back on Conversational Witchcraft with the very amazing J. Allen Cross. This is such a fun conversation. I'm learning so much from you, and I'm so excited to learn all this stuff, because it's really like your journey is so unique. Okay, so here's a question for you. What's a common myth about Mexican folk magic that you want to debunk? Is there just
one?
You're
gonna get me in so much trouble.
Not my intention. So much trouble. But like, listen, like I said at the beginning of this, I know nothing about Mexican folk magic. And I would guess that there's a lot of people that know nothing and make assumptions. And you would be the person to debunk that. So pick an easy one, because there's probably 1,000.
There are 1,000. All right. Okay. Do we want to get real here for a moment?
That's up to you. It's up to you. It's up to you.
This one's very important, but it's going to make a lot of people angry because it challenges a very common belief.
Okay.
Similarly to when everyone found out that Wicca is not an ancient pre-Christian religion.
No, it's not.
It's not. Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. With 1920, 1922.
Yes. Yeah. So there's this very firmly held belief by a lot of people that brujería is an indigenous Mexican practice. Now, the way that it is practiced today in some areas has been influenced by the indigenous people. It's very important. Very important. I ask people, though, who tell me this, that they're like, well, you know, brujería is an indigenous practice. I'm like, okay. And what does the word brujería mean? Like, well, it means witchcraft. Like, great. In what language? Spanish. Brujería came from Spain. It was brought over by the colonizers. That is a fact. It is an uncomfortable truth to swallow, but it is true. The indigenous people had their own magic that is, I'm certain, named in their own language. But brujería itself came over from Spain. And that is something that's very difficult for a lot of people to wrap their brains around, because a lot of books say, oh, brujería is an ancient indigenous practice. There's books out right now that say it. There's books that are about to come out that say it. This is simply not true.
Right.
It makes people more comfortable,
right,
to believe that.
Right.
And again, that's not to say that the indigenous people, how brujería is practiced today, had nothing to do with it. Of course, you know, that stuff always gets mixed in, always gets blended in. So that is a thing.
Yeah, I mean, that is what we were saying. Like the ancient cultures, where's the threads of that ancient culture, because it dovetails over time, right? And for us living in, 2022, 100 years ago was a long fucking time ago. 200 years, 300 years. When the colonizers came over, it's a time that we can't even imagine. We can't imagine what life was like. None of us can know what that was like. So to us, that's ancient, but it's not ancient. It's very recent. Right? That is 200 years ago is very recent. In the span of history, especially when you're talking about ancient cultures, right? Native American ancient cultures that have been here for thousands of years, or 1,000 or however many thousands. Again, don't write to me that I got my dates wrong. But yeah, that's and that is a huge thing that I would not have thought of, because right now there is a lot of sensitivity around things like that, as there should be.
Yeah.
But my next question, that again, maybe a little controversial, if I was in a store as an Italian American woman, as a, kitchen witch, I wouldn't pick up this book, because I would say, this book isn't for me. It's not appropriate for me to read this book or practice these practices. And from chatting with you and looking through your book and getting into some of the things you have going on here, I'm going to say that's not true, and that it is okay to pray to some of these saints if you feel connected with them. It's okay. I mean, can you give me permission? No, but yes. Really, people might not explore these practices because they are worried about being too careful in the other direction. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So I want to start this by saying that I love the intent of social justice culture and talking about cultural appropriation, all those things. Those are very important conversations for us to have, things for us to be aware of, and things for us to be sensitive during. That being said, occasionally we get it wrong, or we take it a little bit too far. So what I'm seeing a lot right now is people coming out and being like, I am an ally to these communities. And the way I'm being an ally is making sure that nobody buys their books, interacts with their content, or, learns from them at all, because that is cultural appropriation. And it's like, great. So we're now supporting people so much that we're no longer allowed to support people.
Right.
It's kind of going around the bend a little bit here. And I ran into this a lot with my book too, is people being like, yes, support this Mexican author of color by not buying his book unless you are this 4% of the population that we've said are allowed to. And that
doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, it's like, okay, I'm so supported that no one can actually engage with my work. So we all need to relax just a little bit, because this stuff, number one, reading and learning is never a closed practice.
Say it again for the people in the back.
Right.
Reading and learning is never a closed practice.
Yes.
Doing things with respect, understanding them, understanding the gravity of things. That's where respect comes from. It's not, well, I'm just not going to do this thing because, someone on social media told me not to. Enter into it with knowledge and respect. Educate yourself is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. And then people take that a step further and then they go, well, it's okay to learn, but it's not okay to practice. I'm like, well, that depends on what you're practicing. If you read my book and it says that limes are good for cleansing.
Limes are good for cleansing.
They are good for cleansing.
Yes.
Whether you're Mexican or not, limes are great for cleansing.
Right. Exactly.
So you can utilize limes for cleansing.
Right.
If you utilize the lime for cleansing and then call yourself a bruja,
that's not okay.
Then we have some problems. Then we're getting into some territory.
Correct.
But simply doing a novena candle spell, utilizing a lime for cleansing, whatever it is not necessarily cultural appropriation. And I break down in the book too, and a lot of people don't know about this, because people come to me, they're like, I want to read your book, but I am either they feel like they're not Mexican enough. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to need you to read like the first 3 pages of this book because they are for you. I am your new tío. We're going to learn the brujería. It's fine. So people either think that they're not Mexican enough, and I'm like, yes, this book was written specifically for people who don't feel like they're Mexican enough.
Right.
And then I have a whole section in the introduction as well that's like, hey, what if you are not any sort of Latino?
Right.
How do we do this? And I am here to hold your hand through this book to help you, because I have a whole section that's like, here's the things I want you to ask yourself when it comes to learning and utilizing the things in this book.
Right.
First question is, are you making money? That's kind of like a first red flag. Like, okay,
right.
You know, are you profiting off of this information?
Right.
Are you taking up space? So did you read this book and then are now teaching at a witchcraft conference all about brujería?
Right.
When that should have probably gone to a person who is some sort of Latino. Probably should go.
I mean, probably. I mean, you would think, you would guess. Yeah, maybe.
Right. Yeah. And the third is, are you erasing culture? And if you can say no to all three of these, then you're probably fine.
Can you define erasing culture a little bit? Absolutely.
So sometimes we like to change the narrative of things a little bit, or a lot of cultural appropriation really comes down to taking something, stripping it of all the details so that it's in the easiest to sell version, the repackaging process of
rebranding,
it, and then yes, and then reselling it. That's the hard part. So where we run into this, Dawn, you froze.
You froze too, but I can still hear you.
Still there? Okay, we're back, I think.
And we're back.
And we're back. So where this comes down to is things like, so I'm trying to think. Okay, so here's one. This is also going to get me in trouble as well. La Santa Muerte, the holy saint of death in Mexican culture, very important in this magical work.
Yep.
Because she's become so popular, people are trying to make her more marketable, which means they're changing her story and changing who she is and what she's about. And if you go to Mexico and speak to people about La Santa Muerte, they will tell you very different things. Then you come to the United States and people are like, oh, she's my mother. She's nothing but pure love and kitten cuddles. And I'm like, have you forgotten that this is death? Like she's the death. Act, like as a verb, the taking.
Right.
Like, so that's something that I find often erases culture in order to make it more marketable. Similarly, too, people don't understand things like they call her their mother a lot in the United States, which I come across. In Mexican culture, that's very offensive. Because number one, you have a mother who's going to smack you upside the head with a chancla for calling somebody else your mother. In Mexico, you call her my godmother. She is your godmother, which is very different.
Wow.
But that gets erased because everyone, there's a parental substitution thing that happens with gods a lot. And also the other thing that's hard to swallow with this particular spirit as well is a lot of people really, really want to make her a deity. She is a saint. She is one of our folk saints that we were talking about earlier.
Right. She's not a god.
No,
she's a saint.
She's a saint. And that's a very important part of her veneration.
Because she's of the people, right? Like we were talking about before, she's of the people. She's not a god, so should not be worshipped in the same way, right? Like that's super important. So again, are you making money? Are you erasing culture? And are you taking up a space where someone of that culture should be? Otherwise, it's totally fine. Like if it's in your own practice, why not? And I'm gonna, and this is gonna get me in trouble. Okay. So if you think you're in trouble now, I'm gonna get in trouble. There's a lot of stuff in the world right now about burning sage.
Yes.
Right. There's a lot of stuff about burning sage. Now I've been a practicing witch for over 20 years. And that was one of the first things that I learned was to burn sage to cleanse a space.
Yeah.
Right. Having no idea this could be cultural appropriation. I mean, I was like 18 years old, right? And like it was the 90s. Who knew? You know, and so now I'm going back and I'm questioning and I'm going, oh my God, am I doing something horribly wrong? if I have a non-witch friend who's like, can you come and do a cleanse? Should I say, well, I have to use rosemary instead of sage? I grow my own sage all the time. Like that, I make my own sage bundles. Sage is one of those things where rosemary, sage, thyme, all the, lavender, they're all things that I feel like are, especially like for me as a kitchen witch, these are things that herbalists and kitchen witches start out with, right? Growing little pots of herbs, you can buy a little potted sage plant at Home Depot, right?
Yep.
So I was talking to someone, and I was writing something about, making herb bundles, herb wands for summer solstice, and then letting them dry out and then being able to use them for Samhain. And I was told I couldn't write that because I'm not allowed to write about, wasn't allowed to write about burning sage. And I was like, this sounds a little crazy to me, but okay. Like, I don't want to offend anybody. And I love that you get into that a little bit. Like you talk a little bit about that, and things of that nature. And so like, I appreciate that because you're 100% right when you say you're growing your own sage, you're not hurting anybody. You're being very conscious about where your ingredients are coming from and that sort of thing. And like, I appreciate that a lot.
Right. Nuance. It exists in the world,
there is gray area, I think is the point. Right. Yeah. And so something like this, something like practicing or learning about Mexican American folk magic can really be enriching for people who otherwise only practice European inspired. But then again, what you said, right? Brujería came from Spain.
Surprise.
So surprise. This is just so exciting and so enlightening. But you have a new book. We have to wrap up soon, right? So this is the book that's out now at the time of this recording, but when this episode airs in September, you're going to have a fancy ass new book out. I believe it is called A Witch's Guide to the Paranormal.
Yes.
Tell us about that project.
Oh, it's something that has been in my brain for about 10 years now.
Wow.
That I'm like, I just need to write a manual for how to do what I do.
Yes.
Because I've been a paranormal investigator for about 15 years now.
Cool.
I started when I was 15, so you do the math on that. I've been using night cream lately. So it's been a minute. And part of what I've really noticed has set me apart as an investigator is the fact that I have a background in witchcraft.
Absolutely.
And where a lot of folks who are paranormal investigators, God love them, are looking to help and be involved, I find when people call them and are like, hey, this thing is in my house, can you fix it? Their answer is no, but I would love to come get it really riled up and take photos.
That's so wrong.
And that's not helpful.
That's not helpful, right? That's not helpful.
Right? At the same time, too, witches, I've had a very interesting response to suggesting that witches enter the world of paranormal investigation, do not see any sort of need. And so I'm trying to fix that a little bit because we as witches have so much to offer.
Right.
And witches as well I've noticed kind of across the board, have this very strange belief that all paranormal investigation happens on and for television. And I'm like, no, that could not be further from the truth.
That's true.
That's not at all true. In fact, television is a very poor example of paranormal investigation.
Yeah,
it's not at all like that.
I would guess just like everything you see on TV, it's not real.
Right.
It's not.
And you would think witches would know that media representation is not always accurate,
I mean,
right. So what I'm trying to do with this book is I'm trying to teach people how to utilize witchcraft skills,
right,
to fix a haunting. And that comes with many different layers because first of all, you have to be able to diagnose a haunting. So you have to know the 4 different types of haunting, which are a residual haunting, an earthbound human spirit haunting, a poltergeist, and an inhuman entity haunting. So these are 4 different types of hauntings that you're going to run into. These are all the hauntings you're going to run into, but you can't fix them the same way.
No.
You can't fix a poltergeist the same way you would a residual haunting, because they're different. They're absolutely different things. So in the book, I teach you not only what these are, but how to identify them, and then how to use witchcraft skills to then fix them so that people can actually get help. And this is what I do a lot on my team with my teammates, is we focus mostly on what we call resolution, or doing a resolve. So we resolve the haunting one way or another. And we've gotten this down to a science where we're in and out in about 4, maybe 5 hours sometimes. Is we get in, we fix it, we get out.
Well, and it's so important too, because like you said, like witches have those skills, right? Especially you are also a medium, right? So, you know, to be able to not just help the living, but the dead, they don't want to be stuck here. You know, in most cases, they don't want to be stuck here. And I would guess I haven't had many experiences with non-human entity in terms of a haunting. Like I've had brownies in my house. You know, like I've had spirits hanging around. We had fairies in our old apartment. And we were always, you know, fairies would take shit and we'd be like, leave the fairy something shiny. And then the thing would, you know, appear. And it was like kind of half a joke, but not really. And I remember my father-in-law came for a visit once and lost his keys. And he was like, oh, I guess it was the fairies. And I was like, leave them something shiny. And I literally put something outside that was like a dime or something, and boom, his keys showed up. So I haven't really had many of those experiences, but I can imagine that little non-human entity probably doesn't want to be there. They're probably just stuck in there like a spider in your bathtub. That spider is like, please don't fucking step on me. Right? Like, so you're not just helping the living, you're resolving for that spirit as well. And I think that a witch enters into that with more respect and understanding than a non-witch.
Well, and I love too what you bring up there, that number one, that when people hear the term inhuman entity, they immediately go to like demons, you know, and that's rarely what it is. You're right. It's a lot. It's like brownies and fairies and things like that show up. And a lot of the times what they need is, they don't need a cleansing. They need like a cultural ambassador to explain to them what the differences are here, but and why they're behaving this way and what we can do. So like you're saying, leave them something shiny. They needed someone there to talk them through, kind of like, here's how you interact with this. Or I had one house that was very severely haunted, and they're like, I'm certain that there are demons in this house. Whatever, we get out there, there were no demons in this house, but what had happened was he built this beautiful house in this forested area and cut down a lot of trees, and the spirits of that area were not happy. So I'm like, this is an inhuman entity, but it's not a demon. It's not an evil spirit. It is something that was here before you that is rightfully very angry. And so then we talk them through, like, here's how we make amends. Here's how we, so a lot of times they kind of need more of like a cultural ambassador than like an exorcism. You know?
Let's talk to these angry tree spirits. They're angry. They're sad. They're hurting. They're in pain. Let's talk to them. Let's fucking apologize for cutting them down and murdering their family. Okay, let's start there. All right. And then let's plant some trees. Let's create a space for them. I think that's brilliant. And I think, like you said, there's really nothing like that out in the world at the moment. And so I think this book, Witch's Guide to the Paranormal, is really going to be a giant hit. So Jay, where can we buy this book, and where can we buy American Brujería, and where can people find you online? Tell us all the juicy bits about how to follow you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to also piggyback on something you said earlier, just because I think it's very, very important. And it's something that I hear from witches as well, is you were talking about how they need help sometimes, you know, like the spider in the bathtub. A lot of times I hear witches talking about paranormal investigation, like these spirits are very happy where they are, and they're just being bothered by the paranormal investigators. And I'm like, if you have a haunting, it's often trying to get your attention.
Yeah.
You don't throw something across a room because you
Yeah.
want people to ignore you and leave you alone.
Yeah.
And to imagine that you would be trying so hard to get somebody's attention for help, and they just go, oh no, you're bothering them.
Right. Can you imagine that you're like sitting, like, imagine you are in distress and you're screaming your head off and you're opening and closing cabinets
Yes.
and you're flickering lights and somebody's like, you fucking bastard, shut up. And you're like,
right.
But I'm hurting. I'm scared. I'm freaking
Yes.
out. You know, I think witches enter into that kind of situation with more compassion than
Yes.
non-witches. And I've done a couple of things, and I would never claim to be a psychic. I would never claim to be an occultist. I would never claim to be that person. But non-witch friends have been like, there's this funky energy in my house. Can you come and fix it? I'm like, I can't really fix it, but I can give you a cleansing, and I can, talk to it and see if I get anything,
see what we can do.
Cause I don't really know what I'm doing, and just go in, feel the space, And there was a friend, she had some really tough stuff going on. She had a woman in her life who was stealing huge amounts of money from her, and like,
oh no,
identity theft, and left a lot of residual shit in the house. And, I kind of went back into that space, and I did, just a little thing, and I talked to whatever energies were there. And I was like, please, just, if you wouldn't mind, please, you're kind of freaking her out. If we could just smooth it, if you could just smooth this, so she's, here's a little space for you over here. And and there was never a problem after that. So like, going into that situation and saying that, listen, that could be me. I could pass from this plane and be distressed, and that could be me. So if we believe that you could pass from this plane and be peaceful, you have to really also believe that you could pass from this plane and be agitated or afraid or whatever. And so I think entering into resolving hauntings with compassion is something that witches can do in more seamlessly, I think, than other people. I think we have a more deeper understanding and less of fear of death and what's behind the veils, right? I mean, we celebrate
that people will be there to help you if it goes wrong for some reason,
right? Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Like if something happened to me and I was like an angry spirit, I know, call Jay. I'll leave it like written down somewhere. Like if I'm an angry spirit, if I'm haunting you, just call Jay so he can chat with me and get me out of here. So
figure it out.
tell us where we can find you and where we can buy all of your books, Jay.
Absolutely. So you can find me online. Kind of my home base on the internet right now is on Instagram. I am at Oregon Wood Witch with a little underscore in between. So it's Oregon_Wood_Witch. Be wary of imposters. A lot of people are pretending to be me. So make sure like the O's in wood are not actually like zeros or something. Because they will scam you. I will never message you offering you a reading, though I have been thinking about it lately because a lot of people have been signing up for that. So you can find me there, stay up to date with everything that is happening. That's also the place. There's a little link in my bio there that you can click, and you can book readings with me, spells with me. I do spiritual coaching. So if there's something that you're having trouble learning, or your spiritual path has just kind of come into a weird spot, you can book time with me to sit down, and we'll talk about it. We'll get you going again. So you can find me there. You can also find me. I do Invoking Witchcraft podcast. So you can find me there with my friend Britton, and we're doing all the things. And my books are pretty much found wherever books are sold. You can find my first one, American Brujería, on Amazon, bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble, all over the place. It came out by Wiser, was a publisher. My second one is from Llewellyn, so you can get it from the Llewellyn website or Amazon. It's available for pre-order, but when this comes out, after September 8th, maybe, it will be available. So it should be
wherever books are sold. So support your local bookshops, bookshops. So you can get it online. Order it from them too. You can order it from your local bookshops. You can order it directly from Llewellyn. You can order American Brujería directly from Wiser. But if you walk into any of your local bookshops, and you have some really freaking great ones in Portland, if you walk into any of those, say, this is what I want, and they will order it for you. Okay, Jay, I know you have to go, but I have one last question.
Yes.
And this is the question I ask every guest on my show. It's like my signature question. I am a kitchen witch. So if you could have me make one magical meal for you, what would it be and why? And usually it's the first thing that comes to your mind.
Oh my God. There is see, I love food. That's the trouble. You know, nothing really beats pizza, especially like homemade pizza.
I am so surprised that you
Really?
would want, yes, because I thought you were going to be like, my grandmother used to make this Mexican dish and she's never made it again. And I thought you were going to be like this great family recipe. But you don't want your family recipe. You want my family recipe.
I do, because anytime you can have an Italian witch make you pizza is good. Though there is this thing, just a weird kitchen moment here. My grandmother did used to make this thing. It was her specialty. Everyone thinks, oh, your Mexican grandmother, so she's gonna make you tamales or whatever. No, my grandmother used to make this thing that she would call golden puffs, which was like French toast, but not. So she'd take like bread and she'd slice it like into long strips, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then she'd batter it in like pancake batter that was kind of thin and eggy.
Mm-hmm.
And then she'd deep fry it. And then put syrup on it.
Syrup, not like cinnamon and sugar?
Well, like she put like the
confectioner sugar, powdered sugar.
Yes, powdered sugar. Yes.
That sounds delicious.
It was. I can never eat it because I don't exercise as much as I need to for that.
I don't either. But there's room for things like that in life. You know what I mean?
It
like
really is.
I have a gluten allergy, which is like the bane of my existence as an Italian person, because like I can make my grandmother's pizza dough, right? And it's the kind of thing that it starts in the morning and it rises, improves all day, you know? And then I actually have my Nona's pizza pan. It's like this huge round pizza pan that came over from Italy. So my grandmother came when she was 6. So it's her mom's pan from Italy from, you know, probably 1820 or not, I'm sorry, 1890 or something like that. Right. And I have it and I never use it because it's just for that dish. And I can't eat that pizza because I can't make it gluten-free.
I will be on the red eye. I will be there in the morning. We can start making that dough.
I'm telling you. And she used to make, do you know what zevela are? No. Okay. So zevela is basically pizza dough that is deep fried and you put a little powdered sugar on it. And it's like what you would get at a carnival. Sometimes there's zevela in New York. There's like big, you know, like fried dough or whatever, but homemade zevela, she would cut them into like she'd make a batch of pizza dough, cut them into little triangles, deep fry them in like a pasta pot. She'd boil, you know, olive oil in a thing. And that would be breakfast.
Yes.
Right.
I love everything you're saying.
Everything, right?
Very into it.
That would be breakfast. Jay, you are a delight. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was so much fun. You taught me so much, and I would love to invite you back at some point and we could talk about your haunting book because I feel like there's so much cool shit to talk about there. Once again, check out J. Allen Cross's new book at the time of this release, which is A Witch's Guide to the Paranormal, and definitely check out American Brujería. Jay, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for having me. And until next time, everyone, I wish you many blessings and so much gratitude. Thanks, everybody.